William Oberdick was 19 years old when he was drafted into the German army during World War II.
We were trained, then the war with Russia came on. We were the last group that had to learn the goose step, because after that, Germany was so hard up that they couldn't waste the time to do all those funny things. So then the troops only learned how to crawl on the ground and shoot straight. That was already a critical time. Then there was a need of troops in Africa, and they asked for volunteers. I came as an infantryist to North Africa. I had studied languages. I had English, French, Italian, and Spanish. So when I wound up in Africa, they put me in Rommel's staff in the intelligence. What we did was listen to enemy broadcasts and translate it and got the information out of them. If we found letters, we would translate the letters. And then later on, when we took prisoners, if they were important prisoners, we would take them to Rommel's staff, and then they would be interrogated.
2 years later, Sergeant William Oberdick himself was a prisoner of war, captured by the American Army at Constantine, Algeria. It was the beginning of a World War II odyssey that would transport him thousands of miles from North Africa to Atlanta, Nebraska, in the middle of the United States. This is a story of a prisoner of war camp and of some of the people whose lives were directly and permanently affected by it. Grant Hazlett, as a young U.S. Army sergeant in 1943, was one of 28 original military guards assigned to the prisoner of war camp in Atlanta, Nebraska.
I remember when we got off the train, why the lady that was the station master down there, we said, well, where's Atlanta at? And she told us just to go around the corner of the building and we'd be looking right up Main Street. It looked more like a setting for some old Western movie or something, like a ghost town. There wasn't anybody on the street, and so we were wondering what we really got into.
Alice Brown was a young woman working as a civilian at a military headquarters in Omaha in the early 1940s. She was a new bride when her soldier husband was notified he would soon be going overseas. She wanted to be with him as long as possible, so she struck a bargain with her military boss.
And so I just jokingly said to the lieutenant colonel, I said, he had made the remark that nobody would go to these small posts, and it's a problem when you can't get experienced people. And so jokingly, I said, well, if you give me a 9-day leave of absence, I'll go out to Atlanta. And he said, you're kidding. And I said, no, I'm serious. And he thought I was kidding, of course. And we talked a little bit more, and so he said, okay. He said, that's a deal. And so he gave me the 9-day leave, and then I transferred out here to work.
When the United States entered World War II, the problem of maintaining enemy prisoners of war was among the last considerations of a country reeling from a Japanese attack and feverishly tooling up for a war in Europe. Yet by the end of the war, America found itself holding nearly 500,000 Axis POWs evacuated from battle areas an ocean away, had placed them in existing or hastily constructed camps across the country, and had dealt with a tangled web of problems involving interrogating, securing, registering, feeding, clothing, entertaining, and even re-educating the prisoners. The Atlanta area had been the final choice of the U.S. government in establishing a $2 million installation for the purpose of controlling prisoners of war. People in the area had a first impression, whether from official word or rumor, that the camp was being built for conscientious objectors.
And of course, then they found out that it was going to be a prisoner of war camp. And of course, like the old story goes, why a lot of people, why they started telling everybody, keep your daughters at home, the soldiers are coming to town, but I think they got treated all right.
Well, I think there was some apprehension when we thought about them going to be so close, but I don't recall anybody being very, very anxious about it at all. There were warnings that you should always keep the keys in your car, take your keys from your car and your trucks, and never to leave clothing on the line during the night, any clothing that an escaped prisoner might get to if he had escaped.
William Oberdick returned to the United States in 1950, nearly 5 years after he left it as a repatriated prisoner of war. Today, he runs a successful apple orchard in the southeastern part of Nebraska, the same orchard he worked as a POW. It was common practice during the war to use non-commissioned prisoner personnel in a variety of jobs. Those who wanted to work received 80 cents a day. Those who didn't were paid a dime.
We worked for Mr. Kimmel picking cherries and apples. We stacked corn and hoed weeds.
Well, my husband hired some of them. They were available for farm help, and they had, I think there were 3 who came. My husband would go pick them up at the camp, and they would work. They worked during thrashing, and during hay baling, and during corn picking, and they would work, I suppose, an 8-hour day. I don't remember that, but they would get them in the morning, and they would work, and at noon we would bring them in the house and feed them with the other crew, which we were not supposed to have done. Well, I think they were not accustomed to the work that was being done, but they picked it up very quickly, I think. And of course, they could not drive motor vehicles, anything of this type.
We came home on furlough. My husband was in his Air Force uniform and came home, and we opened the dining room door, and there were about 12 or 15 POWs at the table with his mother serving them, just like it was part of her family. And they worked that way out in the fields, too. And that was the thing that amazed me as I would go out, like the next day, and watch them use the topper with the cane, was you would have thought being prisoners, they'd been dragging their feet, you know, or unhappy or sad, but it just like they were all one family, and they were moving just as fast as if they would have been part of the family to get the field work done. There was no feelings of hostility between the family nor between them.
Working outside the confines of the camp was welcome diversion to most of the POWs, but after quitting time and back behind barbed wire, what then?
One of the things that we all appreciated was the fact that they were very interested in learning the American language, the English language. And when they were working, they always carried their German-American dictionary with them. And so whenever you used a word that they weren't familiar with, they'd yank their dictionary out of their pocket and want you to show them that particular word so that they could learn it. And of course, we couldn't help but pick up some German words too. The ones that I was around were very interested in becoming oriented with our way of living and the things that we did and learning about it. Yes, they were very friendly.
During that wartime period, it was argued that America should be taking advantage of the opportunity to improve the captives' education. Prisoners were not only to be taught democracy in the classroom formally, but outside as well, when some of the POWs worked the fields for local farmers and ranchers. One such employer was William Richards, a former rancher and now a banker in Holdridge.
I thought at that time that it was too bad that we were adhering so closely to the Geneva Conference rules on PWs, because we were missing a bet not indoctrinating those PWs as to what we mean by right of free speech and religion and right of assembly and free press. But I'd get those guys together because they were a captive audience. They couldn't get away from me. And I'd try to tell them what we meant by freedom of speech and freedom of religion and right of press and so forth. One of these boys was a banker in Germany. And he was giving me a lot of static, and he could speak pretty fair English, too. He was giving me a lot of static about my indoctrination of right of free speech and religion and so forth. And he made a statement that I thought was most telling. He says, Mr. Richards, he says, you can talk about all these freedoms you want to, but he says democracy begins in the stomach.
It was not until VE Day that the educational program was publicly disclosed, and the program continued until the beginning of the prisoners' repatriation in 1945. Today, Grant Hazlitt is postmaster in Lomas, Nebraska, just a few miles from the site where he once guarded the German POWs.
I was assigned 8 prisoners that I had a little shop there I was in charge of. And you know, there was a funny thing, a lot of those German soldiers, they all had some kind of a craft that they were proficient in. Carpentry, tool and die men, diamond cutters, a little bit of everything, all kind of professional people.
He told me one day, I'm a little bit suspicious of the man that I've got with me. He's one of the most trusted men I've ever had, but he asked me for a pair of pliers. And he said, really, I shouldn't let him have them. And then another time he said he asked me for an Ingersoll watch. What kind of a device is he making? Would he do anything violent? And Bob was concerned. And then one night he came in with his arm around the shoulder of the man he'd been talking about, and he said, I want to show you why this man asked for an Ingersoll watch and a pair of pliers and bits of wire. And he held out his arm, and he had a self-winding watch this man had made from what we called the dollar watch in those days. And then the man explained, well, you see, I was a watchmaker by profession in Germany before he had been captured. And this was the experience of many of the people who hired them, that they had skills not to pick corn.
There isn't much left of Camp Atlanta these days. Some concrete slabs, crumbling chimneys, and gnarled trees are about all that remain of the grounds that once supported 70 buildings, crisscrossed by 7 miles of roads. At its peak, Camp Atlanta was the largest German prisoner complex in a 9-state area. Thousands of officers and enlisted men were processed through the main complex and its 15 branch camps across Nebraska. Today, it's mostly grazing land, cornfields, and the site of the Nebraska ETV Network's transmitter serving the south-central area of the state. Between 1943 and 1945, however, it was a wartime operation run by 600 military personnel and 130 civilians. In the summer of 1977, William Oberdick returned to Camp Atlanta and walked over grounds once familiar to him.
Bill, according to what you said coming out here, and as much as you can remember, this transmitter site, this building, is the probable location of the theater and the chapel. Let's take a walk around the grounds and see if there's anything that we could pick out that you might recollect right offhand.
Well, I like to do that. Maybe I can even find the building that I was
Yeah,
put in.
that's right.
Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Oberdick, we're standing near what used to be the headquarters building during the camp's heyday in the mid-40s. What can you describe of the camp that you remember?
Well, I know when we were taken off of the train, we would march down a lane between buildings that were occupied by the American guards and by the American officers. Then finally we would arrive at a bigger guardhouse, would be let in the compound, which consisted of 3 parts, and each part had again a gate through which we were let in. So we had to pass 2 gates to get into the barracks. And I know down a slope there was the infirmary, and on weekends we would be let out of the camp and went to the movies. We came over here from the front lines in Africa, and all of a sudden we were surrounded by the wide open spaces, the peace and quiet, and the treatment that we received here was altogether different from the treatment that we even received in the German army. The tables, like they were set, we had never seen before in any big organization. We were just flabbergasted. Matter of fact, when we were led into the mess hall for the first time, we wondered what the Americans would be up to treat us that well.
What were some of the activities that you took part in when you were actually here at the camp?
We came here from Concordia, Kansas, with 250 men to build this camp up to get it ready for the more German prisoners that were taken in Italy. So for a while we were here only 250 people, and then when the shipment arrived, then we were finally filled up to 3,000 here in Atlanta, and they were mostly prisoners from Italy. And during the time I was here, I worked in the kitchen. I spent a short stretch in the American officers' mess, also as a cook.
Then for a while I was in charge of the ash and trash hauling command. Then whenever there was a chance to volunteer for work, I would volunteer. And at one time I worked for Perry's here, the lumber yard in Holdridge. And for several weeks we worked in Atlanta, in Alma, in Cudahy's chicken plant. Then there was another chance to volunteer to Grand Island, where I helped 6 weeks in the potato harvest. Then we were sent back here, and there was another chance to volunteer, and I wound up in a labor camp in Weeping Water. And there my fate started to change. I met very nice people there in Nebraska City, and I decided at that time already that I would like to come back to Nebraska. And then after the war, in 1946, I came home, and after 4 more years, I was ready to be admitted to the United States with my family. It is very difficult to reconstruct the camp just from memory, seeing just all that rubble here and the concrete slabs. But I think this must have been the colonel's bathtub, because we sure didn't have it.
What did you have, by the way, as far as
well, we had
sanitary
showers,
facilities?
hot showers, regular showers, hot and cold water. We had all the washroom facilities that you can ask for in the Army.
Prisoner of war camps in the United States adhered strictly to the Articles of the Geneva Convention. Camps at large were obligated to appoint representatives to deal with camp administrators and inspection teams on its behalf, an opportunity seized most often by the more aggressive Nazis who were part of the prisoner population. The success obtained by the Nazis within the camps sometimes created a totalitarian environment in the prisoner system.
There was no time that I know of that there was any particular problem, except one time when one of the prisoners who was a Nazi was disciplining one who was not, and they had a little argument that ended up in a fist fight, but it was no serious injuries, and otherwise I'm sure they were never any problem.
They had their own police force, you might say, right within their own ranks, and they were scared of each other, and you get one by himself out behind a barrack someplace and talk to him, and he would tell you a lot of things, but yet if he'd happen to see a shadow come around the corner, why, he couldn't speak any more English than I could talk German. But that's just the way it was.
Despite activities, freedom from abuse, and relative security, the men were still prisoners, and psychologically they were conscious of it. However, of the total of more than 425,000 Axis prisoners interned in this country, only 1,800 escaped, and the vast majority were at large for only 1 day.
They'd taken a work detail out here by Arapahoe, and they had forgotten one. They hadn't found enough noses when they brought him back, and he hitchhiked back. Of course, he had a big PW all over him, but I guess when he walked up the gate, why, he really set things a-buzzing out there. But that was the only one that they said they ever had any trouble with.
Another of the Geneva Convention articles stipulated that prisoners must be maintained with food, lodging, and clothing on the same footing as troops of the captor government. This meant that German POWs were guaranteed the same quality of food, quarters, and clothes provided our own GIs.
I should say first plentiful, but the German boys did their own cooking. So if we had to complain about the food, we would have to complain to the German boys because they prepared it. We had a regular kitchen with a big walk-in freezer and walk-in cooler, I should say. And we had white dishes. We had forks, knives, spoons, more than we ever had before, because in the German army, most of the time we ate out of a tin can. There was an American assigned to every company, and he would supervise, but the food preparation was a German responsibility.
The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Alice Brown recalled the prisoners' reaction to VE Day at Camp Atlanta.
Joy. They were glad the war was over. Very apprehensive about what they would find when they went back, because many of them had been in the war like 7 or 8 years and had never heard anything from their families. They didn't know whether there was any of them left or a few of them left and what was left of their homes, and they were very apprehensive about what they would find when they went back.
Because of the size of the camp and the differences in their activities, our story's 3 main characters had not previously met. So it was a spontaneous first encounter when they got together at the old campsite more than 30 years later.
I was the chief of civilian personnel.
I was one of the soldiers out here at that time when it was first organized.
Well, and I was one of the guys on the other side of the wire.
Were you a former prisoner?
That's right. Well, when I volunteered to go to Atlanta from Concordia, I figured I would wind up in Georgia.
Yeah.
A lot of people figured that, you know. They'd say something about the PW camp in Atlanta, and especially if you were down in headquarters, it was real funny because they'd say, Atlanta, Georgia, what are you doing here? Atlanta, Nebraska. Never heard of it,
No.
you know.
There's not really much that draws me here.
No.
Also, I had a good time here. It was a new experience, and
I
well,
think things were quite congenial here, though, weren't
that's
they?
right.
The officers were pals.
Yeah, you could get along with the servicemen real good, but some of the officers, why, they were pretty hard to handle. I mean, they were
demanded their rights and all that.
I think
And,
that's why we had such a congenial camp here, is because we had all enlisted
no
men except
officers
this
here.
one doctor.
Well, then did you,
We were treated well.
did they send you back to Germany and you come back here
Well,
again then
I
afterwards?
understand that is a law that all the
Yeah,
prisoners
that
have
was
to
right.
Yeah.
A lot of the fellows would have liked to stayed here because now the fellows who worked in headquarters where I was, I became quite well acquainted with some of them because some of them were from the area where my husband was stationed over in Germany.
go. Uh-huh.
So we had a lot in common to talk about, and I know a lot of those fellows would like to stay, but the Geneva Conference rules said
Yeah.
you had to go back and then you could come back. How long were you over there then when you came
4
back?
years.
4 years.
And then you came back.
Then you had to be screened first and denazified, and they had to check your records and before they would let you into this country. When the war came to an end, the Germans were quite disturbed or upset. Several cried, but the American captain, he came over to me and he said, Bill, do you think we can leave them alone? My boys, they want to celebrate a little bit. So we were without guards for about two or 3 days there.
Well, they started phasing out. I think it was about September, October of 45.
Yeah, we left here in November 45.
Yeah, I think
End of October 45.
yeah, I think September and October they started phasing out. I don't think the one for the theater is here anymore. It doesn't
No.
look like.
I think it would be down in here. Along in here someplace. If possibly that where that square block place there is.
Wasn't that the vault that was in the compound right there? Captain Ashmore was the stockade commander.
Yeah.
And there was a building there, of course, looked like all the rest of the buildings, and I'm sure that was the vault that belonged. It was out just outside the fence. That
Well, that
belonged
could
to
be
the
because where those
that one right
where
there.
those three things are with the spikes sticking up out of them.
That was a guard tower.
That
wasn't
would be
it?
a guard tower. Cause see, it shows right here, and but that looks like it could be one of the guard towers there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then the fence would have come up along here
No,
on
The
the
fence-
outside. See,
It would have been outside of both of those.
yeah.
our barracks, the barracks I was in was along the first row, and that was down by past those trees where you see that bricks down there. Right here looks like. Now this could have been. No, it wasn't that close though.
No, I think this was inside the compound, whatever
Yeah.
it was. I don't know because I was never
Right
inside
here
the
you see-
compound.
You see, now here's your long buildings, and that's what those are there. I would say this is the one that's inside the compound.
Yeah, I'm sure
No.
that was.
Because you see here,
I
just the
think
way
we
they've
haven't
got.
reached that point yet. The compound is a little further over. We
Well,
walked over there
yeah,
yesterday.
they had what?
A big garden. It was in the
Well,
summer
yeah.
of 44 and again in the summer of 45. They had a huge garden out here.
Yeah, that was for the water
But I'm
supply.
sure that right here, we're in the compound area. All these
Slabs.
slabs were
Yeah.
all barracks.
Yeah, this whole perimeter
Right
here.
And I don't have the faintest idea how many barracks there were in the compound area.
I
just
don't
do you
recall.
know?
I don't recall.
No, I think there
offhand
were
either.
4 in the mess hall for every company.
And how many companies did we
There were-
have?
There were 4 in each compound,
Yeah.
and there were 3
Three
different compounds. I figure there were 3,000 people here altogether.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there was, and then you see, then when we started putting them out in side camps, at one time we had almost 5,000. This is where the prisoner barracks
It was
are.
during that reunion that Oberdick told his version of the camp's single escape.
All right, tell me what you heard.
Well, we thought well, if you get out of here, go to Canada or go to the Rocky Mountain. And this particular fellow, he was a nature boy. He thought that he could wait out the war in the Rocky Mountains. So we were surprised that one morning he was gone. And we found a hole in the fence, but we covered up for him. At the roll call, nobody was missing. And then late in the afternoon, or whether it was on the same day or on the next day, I do not recall, but well, it was towards evening, I should say. And he was back with us. And all the work details had come into the compound already, and nobody was missing. And then finally, one fellow comes up to the guard, and the guard mentions to him, "They forgot to pick you up?" And he said, "Yes." So the guard opened the gate, and then he opened the second gate to let him into our compound, and everything was forgotten.
That's probably the right story. The story I got was the one that the gate guard told when he came walking in the gate. And the story he told in order to get in the gate was that the guard had left him at the farm where he was working, and he didn't have any way back, so he had walked back to camp. And I know this guard told the story, and when he told it, he thought it was real funny. He said, "I just said to myself, Gerke, you better buy different liquor."
Repatriation of prisoners of war began in July 1945. The general feeling among Americans when the POW experience ended was probably, thank goodness it's over.
About all that's left of Camp Atlanta are these concrete slabs and piles of rubble like this. What are your feelings about the camp and this visit to it nearly 4 decades later?
Well, at this point, I would say that the Camp Atlanta, although it was a prisoner of war camp, and most people connected with a lot of hardship and deprivation, was one of my most pleasant experiences, and it changed my life considerably. Because here I met new friends, new people. I saw the scenery of Nebraska. I liked it here. I liked it a lot better what I had seen before. And it was here in Nebraska that I made up my mind that I would return. And when I look now at the rubble, I would say, for me, a lot of good came out of this camp. And here finally we get to clean up the old campsites that are bitter reminders of a war that should be long forgotten.
When Camp Atlanta was revisited, we found the experience had different effects on prisoners, military personnel, and civilians. The camps were not all alike in nature and conditions. The prisoners responded as individuals to their entire military experience in this country. Our story brought out the point that at least the lives of 3 persons were strongly affected by the existence of a POW camp. Alice Brown was relocated in her career because of her love for her husband. Grant Hazlitt left Atlanta with a new wife and later returned to the area. And William Oberdick, who had a pleasant experience during an otherwise troubled time, returned to the country that at one time had interned him, but which later welcomed him as a citizen. The segments featuring Mrs. Alice Brown in the preceding program, Atlanta Revisited, were recorded in the spring and summer of 1977. Mrs. Brown died in late 1977. She was a very knowledgeable and enthusiastic participant in the program. Her help in providing information about the former prisoner of war camp was invaluable. Although Alice Brown was not here to see the program, she left a warm feeling among the many persons who knew and worked with her. It was a privilege that will be remembered.